Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all on this early Sunday morning. It's early for me. So my name is Monique Thomas. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the former warden here at All Saints, which, for those who don't know the Episcopal language, is basically chair of our church board. I've been a longtime member, and I'm also a diversity, equity, inclusion professional trainer. And so I am so excited to be here. I was asked to come back this week for the second in our series on Black history is the future. And again, we will be diving into Afrofuturism. This week, I am joined by these incredible ladies up here, and we're going to be talking about Octavia Butler and her legacy. And so we will get started with some introductions. First, right here immediately to my left is Nikki. Hi. Nikki is the owner of Pasadena's newest independent bookstore, Octavia's Bookshelf. The bookstore will highlight authors who are BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Nikki chose the name as a tribute to Pasadena native and science fiction author and MacArthur Fellow, Octavia Butler, who died in 2006. Nikki said she was the first Black sci-fi writer that I read, and it was the first time that I saw Black people in the future. And we talked a little bit about that last week, about how do we see ourselves in the future. Octavia's bookshelf is scheduled to open February 18th. Woo! And I've got my swag, I've got my button on promoting it. And it will be located at 1361 North Hill Avenue, so not that far from here. Next to Nikki is Dr. Ayana Jamieson, who has been here before. Dr. Jamieson is the founder of Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. Her work centers around the intersections of critical depth psychology, race, culture, and mythology. Certainty of Flesh, a biomythographical reading of Octavia E. Butler's fictions, which is her dissertation, explores Butler's biographical origins and the mythic aspects of her literary work. And next is, I was going to say PhD candidate, but I just found out that she is now Dr. Tamisha Tyler. Tamisha earned her PhD in theology and culture from Fuller? From Fuller, yes. Her work focuses on theopoetics and the arts, with her most recent project centering on the work of Octavia Butler. She serves in leadership at Kinship Commons, a worship collective that designs workshop experiences centering the work and life of people of color. So again, a stellar panel that we have this week. So we're going to dive in. Last week I started with the same question, and so I want to ask you all, with a little bit more. Afrofuturism has been gaining more and more mention, as we know, over the past several years. In your own words, how would you define it? And what has been Octavia Butler's impact on your relationship to the genre? So a two-part.
Be the person with the information most immediate in your fresh, dissertating mind. That I feel like this is like post-doc hazing, but it's fine. You know, par for the course, par for the course. When I think about futurism, I think about the way in which Black people write themselves in the future where they are thriving. I think about it also as the intersections of the acknowledgement of the multiplicity of our histories, combined with the arts, technology, all of the different aspects of who we are and how we create our own futures for ourselves, particularly not centering whiteness, right? Octavia Butler is one of the pillars of Afrofuturism, with the likes of Sun Ra and the orchestra, and also Parliament and Funkadelic. So you have these different aspects of music, of the arts, of literary worlds. The reason that I think Octavia Butler is so central to Afrofuturism is because she wrote herself into future. She's known as saying, like, I wanted to write a world with me in it, right? And so she creates these aspects of futures that don't ignore the histories that we're inheriting, but deals with them and creates new ways of being, new ways of gathering, and new ways of thriving. So I think that just her work as a standalone, when there were very few African Americans in the literary world of science fiction, and when she herself didn't see a lot of people or read a lot of people who looked like her that were writing, she took that step into writing herself into her future, and so many people take that as inspiration to remember how to write themselves into their future. So that's how I define it.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I don't know. I have a complicated relationship with that word Afrofuturism because it was coined in the 90s, but I will draw back to what Octavia regarded herself as, which is a histofuturist. And if you want to know more about that, we've talked about it before, but there's a beautiful book called by Dr. Shelley Strebe, who's an ethnic studies professor, and she talks about how Butler called herself a histofuturist, someone who is not just a historian only telling the hero's narrative with only one person's story in mind, but someone who extrapolates from the known present and considers the future as a collective endeavor that we all need to be aware of in order for us all to make it there together intact, right? I like Black speculative arts because that could be anywhere. It could be in the kitchen, it could be in the garden, it could be in the classroom, it can be, obviously on the album covers that my parents had, right? Earth, Wind, and Fire is not Afrofuturist, but how many pyramids, like I know all those songs. I know Philip Bailey's voice anywhere, right? And that triumphant of Black sacred music and, worship in everyday existence. So I feel like it's very expansive and includes people that maybe are not theorists or artists or published, but, like my grandmama pouring too much milk in her coffee so that and carrying it around in a bowl so that she could have whatever spilled. I feel like that abundance is what helps us to feel that we're surviving, right? So I think for me, I realize there's this legacy that Butler has in Pasadena that is kind of erased when we only look at Black Panther or think about like, oh, here's all this shiny new stuff, but people have been surviving and rewriting their own histories, changing their birth dates. Like we know all of the folklore, so-called folklore that Zora Neale Hurston and other folks were extracting from. So we really have to include this Black intellectual tradition that comes from the ground and expands throughout the universe, literally, Octavia E. Butler landing. So like, I'm all about it, all about all of it, all Black everything. Yeah.
I love that. And I almost wish we had bingo cards for the terms that we used last week. Earth, Wind, and Fire came up, Zora Neale Hurston came up. So I love the through line. And I like that you were talking about co-creating this history, because that's what I go back to here in terms of how do we decenter whiteness and come to the table together in terms of creating history. Well, we co-created, right? And we look at centering the voices of people of color, particularly Black people. So thank you for that.
Hi, everyone. So my perspective comes as a reader. I was an early reader. I read everything I can get my hands on. I would find books at my mom's friends' houses, and they were like books I shouldn't be reading. And so I just read everything. And so then I started to read a little bit of science fiction in my early teens, and it wasn't until somehow someone referred Octavia Butler to me as to read Kindred, and I did, and it was the first time I saw myself or someone who looks like my mother or my aunts or, what have you, written into this sort of time travel book, and I was hooked after that. And there weren't too many writers who wrote in that genre, and I mean, you kind of touched on, we didn't know where to put her, so we just said science fiction, but that's clearly not how Mrs. Butler saw herself. So as an avid reader, she just helped to open my eyes to so many more Black writers who were writing science fiction or writing, these magical fantasy stories I had not really had an opportunity to read in the past. And I was just struck by the way that she wrote, the richness of her characters, you know, and also being from Pasadena, you know, when she nods to places in Pasadena, I'm like, I was there yesterday. You know, that's so fun. But it expanded my view of science fiction, and I started to read more Black writers and other writers of color that were writing about science fiction, and I felt so connected to it. So, I mean, in the question you asked about Afrofuturism, I think it's really celebrating our past, our present, and our future, and writing ourselves into it so that, you know, we can see ourselves outside of the boxes that we have been put in the past. And so I'm just ever so grateful that I was introduced to her writings, and you know, her impact is huge on me because I'm opening a bookstore called Octavia's Bookshelf. So
That is amazing. And just the way that her work inspired you, all of you, to put that into your work, but to physically create a building. And I don't know if those of you, some of you have probably heard of At.a.m bookstore, was a historically Black bookstore, is no longer existing. And so to have not only a new independent bookstore, but a Black bookstore and close to me, I don't have to drive all the way to South LA anymore, is wonderful. And I will say that the point that all of you are making, the reason why, for those of you who didn't hear before, we were coming up with concepts for what we wanted to do around Black history and what a forum would look like. And I specifically said I don't want it to be steeped in struggle, because we hear enough about struggle and oppression, and you know, that's not our whole story. And Black people, we are a rich culture of people. We are people that are about hope and aspirations and building ourselves up. And so, you know, we can talk about the struggle, but we don't want to stay there. And so that's why this particular genre and the work of these women is so important, because again, it's that conversation between not forgetting our past and our history, but how do we pull from that, exist in the present, and place ourselves forward. And that's something that's just really important. So thank you. So don't let me preach, no. So Butler's works, as we know, are very imaginative, and it can be found, as we just said, in science fiction, although maybe it doesn't necessarily belong there. But her work also has a way of deeply impacting folks on a soulful and personal level. In what ways has she personally impacted and influenced who you are today?
I can go first. I mean, I literally wrote a book on her when I was only being assigned old dead white men in my program, and a little bit of Fanon, and a little bit about liberation psychology. But I was like, oh, this is kind of soul-sucking. And I was a substitute teacher, so I was working in spaces where students were dealing with lots and lots of trauma. I was not the person who could go and get a clinical degree and essentially work for free for 1,000 hours in order to do that kind of work, but I really wanted to be doing community-engaged care. I mean, I'm an ethnic studies professor, but the way that I gained my training is by studying Octavia Butler and the geographies of Pasadena, Altadena, Los Angeles, Black migration patterns, et cetera. So there are things that I know about myself or that I've researched that I thought were just research, but really, you know, one of my great-grandfathers like made horseshoes for Wyatt Earp and all kinds of things that I would not have been interested in. I was thinking like, oh, I'm just here and now. So she really asked us to look not only at our personal histories, but what are the stories of people around us. And I think, you know, she trains you to expand your thinking that doesn't just include your own subjectivity. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to answer this question because I'm like obsessed with Octavia Butler. It's like my whole, like books are my religion, right? And so her writings are so foundational to my way of thinking and being in the world. And so that's such a huge question. But I exist like in community with folks like this. She gives us each other. And I say this all the time, but she really gives us each other, because whoever is around you when the apocalypse hits, those are the folks who you need to share your skills with. But that's what Black folk and like immigrants and marginalized people and women have been doing for the whole time they've existed. This is you know, her just articulating the method and the plan. and giving us some hints. I mean, I don't know, that's not a good answer. But I think it's the truth, though.
So, for me, reading her books, I think about Parable of the Sower. With all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And I mean, that hits different, right? Like, especially with the things that she wrote about. She was touching on global warming, drug addictions, the fall of public education. It was very moving and prophetic, because here we are now. And I think at the time of writing that, she said we have about 30 years until that happens. And we see so much of it playing out, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. And so for me, I think the impact of her writing is, how can I be a part of that change? Because Miss Butler says very clearly, there is no one answer. There are thousands at least. And so if I can be one answer or inspire someone to be another answer, and collectively we can do something to, I would say, make amends with what we've done to this world and to the people in it, and how we can change. So I'm constantly thinking about her words there. The only lasting truth is change. And so I really lead by that. She has changed me, my way of looking at the world. I'm inspired by her, the daughter of a shoe shine man and a maid. And she said she wanted to be a writer, and she got, it was sort of, when she would tell people that as a child, like, she got gentle condescension. But public school education made her, or gave her the tools to be the person that she became, and the great writer that she was. So, that inspires me. So I'm thinking about, the way our public school systems look around the world, and especially in very specific states. We can be part of that change, because we understand the importance of public education. Look what it did for Miss Butler. I went to public school. Look what it did for me. So I feel like her words are always ringing in my head. I too am obsessed with Octavia Butler, clearly. So I think that's my answer. Yeah.
Who's not obsessed with Octavia Butler? It's not a bad obsession to have. I think one of the things that really hit for me, I had read Butler when I was younger. I think I read Kindred, and I was like, oh, this was amazing. I'm going to read everything. And then life, I started my doctoral program in September of 2016, and by the end of that first week, J.R. Thomas was killed by the police. And I had entered into a doctoral program, young, budding theologian, thinking about artists, thinking about how to care for artists. And then that happened, and everything in my program changed. We started the Subversive Liturgy Project, and as we stood at the police station and, praying, and I don't know what we were doing, I had to figure out what it meant to be a theologian in a world where hope got real complicated. And I burned out by January. I was very burnt out. And I said, I got to take a break. And so summer, I didn't do any classes. I quit all the jobs I had. I moved out of my apartment. I was like, I'm just going to house hop. I don't know what to do. And I don't see her here, but Edna Trigg, who is a friend and still is a friend and was at the liturgy, said, there's this exhibit happening at the Huntington on Octavia Butler. here's 2 free passes. Why don't you go see that? And I was like, oh, that sounds great. I remember Butler. So I go and I get a chance to see the exhibit and I read her journals. I'm going to do this, and this is the kind of writer that I'm going to be. And just all of these affirmations and all of these spaces in which she's naming the truth of who she is, naming the truth of the world, and then she is creating worlds. She's doing this simultaneously, and it reminded me a lot of my journals when I was younger, my crazy little journals that nobody should read. And I said, why did I stop reading her? And I said, I'm just going to pick her up again. And I look up, and I'm standing in the middle of the room, and I look up, and there's this huge poster with an advertisement with like one of the covers of Parable of the Sower. And so I go, oh, yeah, I can start there. And so I just pick up Parable of the Sower, and I read it that summer. And I read the first book, and I go, what just happened? Remember, young theologians still got to figure out, because their advisor's like, so what are you doing your dissertation on? Still got to figure out what I'm doing. And it was like all of the questions that I had, particularly, what are the artists doing? How are they responding to what they are seeing in their world? Everything fell into place through Lauren. And I went back to school, and I was like, oh my God, have y'all read this? Have y'all heard of Octavia? And everybody was like, no. And I was like, what is happening? And at the moment where, through other conversations, I decided to focus on Butler for my dissertation, at that moment, believe it or not, I didn't know at that point she was from Pasadena. And I didn't know at that point that the exhibit represented a whole archive of her work. Until my advisor was like, oh yeah, you could just, go there. And everything fell into place. And so for me, Butler has taught me what it means to be a young theologian in the midst of complicated hope. And to remember that there is spaces and times for collective world building, for spaces of coming together, like you were saying earlier, and building and creating new and better worlds based on the histories and the stories that we have inherited, even in the midst of complete and utter chaos, that it's still a necessary thing to do. Lauren, in that novel, has done more shaping for my Christian faith than any Christian theologian that I've encountered. And Lauren's not Christian. Her first iteration was like, my daddy God, stop being my God. My God is another name, right? And so she enters into this new space and completely changes everything for me. And it's still, and Butler, through her sense of world building, is still teaching me that, there's a lot more than what I've inherited. There's a lot more than what I've been told, not only about our world and that complicated hope, but about who God is and about who we are in relation to God. So.
I feel like I want to just kind of meditate on that complicated hope. I don't know that I've ever heard it put that way, but it spoke somewhere so deep in my soul, and particularly as a Black person, and particularly as a Black woman. Because as I said before, we are hopeful people, but that hope, right, is not blind hope. We are living in very complicated times, as we always have, and somehow we hang on to that hope. And part of it is because we know that change is God. It's that sense, not going back to Barack Obama. He actually chose great words with that hope and change, right? Because it is centering in who we are as Black people and who we are as communities. But that whole idea of complicated hope, that hope is not blind, it's not naive. Sometimes it's very complicated to be hopeful in the world that we live in. So thank you for that. The next question is kind of a follow-up to that. How has Butler helped you understand what could be our way forward into a future that we all want to live in? What does it mean for you to be that author of projecting yourself into a future that we all want to live in?
think the things that keeps coming up for me as a person who's always been a teacher and a big sister, and I think one of the things that helped to transform my understanding of this question, I have to ask myself this as a parent or as an auntie, right? Or as a person in a family, like who else is in my family? Do you know what I mean? How can I include other people in that? Who included me in those spaces? I have a second grader and a sixth grader, and their ages are so far apart, but I continually learn about myself, or even other children. When someone's like, hey, so-and-so's mom, like, you know, I cease to be this individual person, and then I'm more aligned with, you know, an ethics of care, right? That's a huge, huge question to think about. One of the things probably Butler does is put this immediacy of like, what do you need in this moment? How can you be present? And I think it's maybe an answer to our fractured world, right? Because I do lots of dissociative things. Some of them are healthy, some of them are not, right? But sometimes we need to like step back and be present with the sensations in our body. And that's something else that comes from Lauren Olamina. She has this thing in the book called hyperempathy syndrome, which means her limbic system is sort of misfiring and overactive in connection with other people's emotional states of pleasure and pain. Most often in this world, it's not very pleasurable, but in the moments where it is, how do we transition out of the space of fear by being in the moment of knowing where we're at or what needs to happen, right? It's not just getting of snacks, but I think young children really call you into this moment of like, okay, obviously, I gotta be paying attention to something else besides my own insecurities or fears or worries or how much things cost or debt or people's political slogans or whatever. So we encourage you all to read Parable of the Sower. I just wanna say, one of the things on my mind is there's a collective, a people's collective that does radical food justice work that are actually going to do a walk that kind of mirrors what happens in Parable of the Sower. And beginning in March, we'll be walking in small sections and moving all the way up the state to, I think, Mendocino County, all the way up in small increments, and then gathering for a collective food justice meal in 2024. Parable of the Sower takes place in 2024. Clay's Ark, which most people have not read, took place in 2021 in the California deserts. So like people keep saying like, how did Octavia predict the future? And what do you think? I'm like, y'all don't even know the extent to which the level of detail. In 2021, in this book, there's a contagion that gets brought back and there's an epidemic. But you know, we're all talking about Lauren Olamina, not Eli the astronaut. So I just hope we all, I feel like it's never just about me, right? It's who else is here that I can connect with and learn from. Who else is the expert on the thing that they know that can help us all? I mean, I guess I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but that's such a huge, huge question. What do you all think?
So I'd say over the last 10 years, I've been constantly thinking about how to be a good ancestor. And so the things that I do on a daily basis, yearly basis, monthly basis, like it's always driven by how can I become a good ancestor? And so a large part of that for me is looking back on my ancestors for guidance, which I consider Miss Butler to be one of them because she gave us such, she gave us stories that we can connect and relate to, and it sort of lights a fire under you. But I also, think about my grandparents and what they did really well in my life. And so I'm always thinking about, my next thing, is this going to make me a good ancestor? Because that's eventually what I want to be remembered that way. And I don't know if Miss Butler thought that way at the time, but she really laid a blueprint for me because it started, because of her, I think about, the popularity of prisons and global warming and, just all of these things that she so eloquently talked about in many of her writings. And so, it's still that burning question for me, how can I be a good ancestor? And so that, for me right now, and it changes, right, depending on where we are in life. During the very beginning of the pandemic, it was me pulling out my sewing machine that I hadn't pulled out in many, many years, and making masks before we figured out those weren't the good masks. And it changes. And so now it's opening this space that prioritizes BIPOC writers so that children and people of all backgrounds, but particularly Black children, can walk in and see themselves celebrated every single day. I truly believe you can't be what you can't see. And I have had the absolute pleasure and blessing of having a support system, excuse me, of people who sort of set the path forward for me. And so that's just what I think about all the time. How can I be a better ancestor? How can I be a good ancestor? How can I be a good living ancestor? Because as you mentioned, you know, with children and nieces and nephews and people that you come across, I just want to touch those people in some way. And I feel like, particularly in this moment, books. We need to be reading in a space where, you know, the most basic of Black history stories are being banned in multiple states and school districts. We need to have a space here, right here in Pasadena, honoring Ms. Butler's legacy by showcasing authors that maybe you've heard of and never read before, rediscovering your old favorites, looking at, you know, new authors, and hopefully this work that I'm doing will touch the lives of someone else and give them the same question: how can I be a good living ancestor? How can I be a good ancestor when I've moved on from this life? So a large part of that comes from the work of Miss Butler and the life that she lived.
I'm just really excited to be here. No, no, I am. I mean, it just, when you discover someone like Butler, and I think you said as well, you discover a whole community. Like, she helps us find each other. And being on the other side of graduate school.
Did you graduate? Is that what happened? Did you get your
hopefully,
PhD?
that's what they told me. You know, I'm gonna just live it out until they tell me different. No. But there's a whole community you enter into, and you enter in with equal parts excitement and trepidation. And one of the things that I learned, or that I am learning from Butler, is that when we talk about things like the future, Afrofuturism, or like, what can we do to create the future so we thrive? How can we do? And it's like, it's so easy to punt, and it's so easy to utilize future talk as an excuse for present passivity. And Butler has taught me to not do that, right? Butler writes about futures, but she's not right. She's writing about things that are happening at the time she is writing, but she's also pushing it toward its end, right? If we continue. And so Butler reminds us that, yeah, there are things in which we are doing to create better futures, but also, what are you waiting for? Like, I want to have a great future, but that doesn't mean that I can't have a great right now, right? Because I'm pretty sure my ancestors wanted a better future, so for me to ignore this present is to disrespect the future that they put, right? And so it's really easy to talk about future things and all these things and stuff, but to move into a new community and to move into new spaces and to be present, I think is where the work is. I think it's the hardest work because it's really easy to dream. It's much harder to like build it, right? And so that's why I think I just have so much respect for Butler, because the worlds that she was building weren't only future worlds. but they were worlds to teach us how to build in the moment that we encountered them too. So yeah.
Oh, that was profound. Thank you. That reminded me of a realization that I just had as I'm moving up in life, and I kept feeling like I was waiting for something. You know how you're waiting for that job, waiting for that man, waiting for that whatever, waiting, where is it? And then I had this realization one night where I was like, wait a minute, I'm the one I've been waiting for. I'm the one who's going to make the change, but I have to start now. I can't be looking outward or what's happening next year or 10 years from now, but what am I doing now to build the future that I want? And part of what kept me present, I worked with college students. I don't have children, and kids keep you present. They will keep you present because they're in your face, even little teenagers. And so I remember I would get weary. I do racial justice work. I get weary, but seeing the hope of them right now and who they are and like they're our future. How do I be a better ancestor? How do I be a better elder? Right? That staying present is what helps propel us to the future. So I love that because we focus so much on, well, what's gonna happen then? What is then? How do we build that now? We have to start now to see the future that we want and invest in our youth and ourselves to get to that future. So I am looking at the time and, oh, shoot. Okay, so I have quick round before we go into the audience. One piece, if people are just learning, and we've name-checked a lot of Octavia's work today, one piece of art, book that you would recommend for people that are just getting into Butler's work?
I would say Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower. Although I love everything that she wrote. Kindred is a really nice introduction. I think she wrote it in 1970. Does that sound about right?
In 1979, but she was writing it alongside the Patternist books.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, let me take that back. Kindred first, and then do the parables. And I have those books with me after your service. If you'd like to buy them after church service, I'll be outside and have a lot of her books for you to choose from. But
Smooth. That was smooth. She's like, these are I'd recommend. And should you need any of them? That was smooth. I don't know. I don't, it's really hard for me to answer this question because I think people are in such different places and Butler's canon is so amazing. I just tell people to read the descriptions and where you feel like you need to enter into. I taught a class. I started my students with Bloodchild. I don't know if that was right, but I just had to throw them in, just throw them in the deep end. I think people ask because it feels like so many of the people that ask me now feel like they want me to say Parable of the Sower because that feels most present to them. But I would always say, read through the descriptions in the life and enter into the spaces. I also loved, why am I blanking on the name? Lilith's Brood, Dawn. I love Dawn. Dawn is also a great introduction, so.
We're all with Nikki, don't worry about it.
I would say that I think it's most important for people to go onto the internet and don't look for the things that we are necessarily saying about Butler, but I think you should look for interviews and listen to her voice. And she was on NPR. She was, on many of the shows that we're still listening to. I think it's very important to hear her speak about who she was. There's a beautiful BBC 3 radio documentary on her life where some of us are speaking, but they have archival interviews from Terry Gross and other folks, and she's talking about who she is and what she believes, and I think that's foundational, which is why I would kind of say there was an Essence Magazine article that was called Birth of a Writer, and she originally wanted it to be Positive Obsession. It's a little autobiographical essay about who she was and how she came to writing, and that's in Bloodchild and Other Stories, which contains all of almost all of her short stories. There's also a Library of America volume that has Fledgling, Kindred, all the short stories, including the ones that were only published on the web, so her very earliest short stories. So there are lots of places to go, but I think it's most important to hear her voice and see who she was. She was a woman who grew to be 6 feet tall by the time she was 12 years old. She had this deep contralto voice. I think that larger-than-life personality, a person who could not shrink themselves and make themselves small in a time when she called Jim Crow California, where she saw people saying, go into back doors, right? Like, Ruby Bridges is the same age as my mother. So let's think about that, right? We're barely in the first generation where women can open their own checking accounts without getting someone else's permission. So the things that she and her family and her mother accomplished, like listen to her own voice, look at her clear eyes, knowing that she had crippling anxiety and fear of public speaking. She was extremely shy, and yet she still gave interviews and taught classes and did writing workshops. So that's what I would think. I think there's an interview that just resurfaced within the pandemic of Stacey Dash. Sorry, not Stacey Dash. Sorry. It's a filmmaker who made Daughters of the Dust. That's why I said Dat, because it's Julie Dash. Sorry. That was a brain. It's early. It is early. Julie Dash interviewing Octavia E. Butler, and that was not widely available. So I think those are the things that are, super powerful. And, interviews on Charlie Rose, and then watch Toni Morrison's interviews with Charlie Rose, and then watch Octavia again. So lots of beautiful things available.
We talked about that Toni Morrison. I did interview with Charlie Rose when he said, "Why can't you center white people? Are you just not able to write about white people?" It was interesting. So we are about at time. Do I have time for one question? Okay, so we have time for at least one question. Tony's gonna go out into the audience and be Phil Donahue today. And Crystal already has her hand up.
I just... Yes. Yes. I second that emotion, and I just wanted to first say just thank you all so much. I don't have a question. It's a little bit of an ego, but I just have to share. I don't know if you knew, but when I graduated from college in '85, there was a feminist bookstore on Lake Street, and then there was a black bookstore on Lake Street. And Octavia would come, and she would sign her books, and I would get to go. And then I was in the entertainment industry, and I was like, we got to get the rights to Kindred. And I called her in the Yellow Pages, and she answered her phone. And my cousin was on the other phone, because we had those kind of old phones where you go. And I said, she said, hello. She has this wonderful. And I was like, I'm Crystal Jones. I work for Vanessa Williams. And I was just wondering if we could get the rights to your, who has the rights? I was just fumbling. And she said, Talia Shire has the rights. But hold on, I have a pot of beans on the stove, and I have to. So, and then I got to sit with her at a dinner, and we honored her at my college. I mean, just so many opportunities, but I am just so grateful that you are carrying on the tradition of a black bookstore in Pasadena. That is just, I bow down. Congratulations to Mika on everything you are, and so thank you.
Which is just a perfect segue for a couple things. So I got like 3 things real quick for you, Nikki. First is you need to tell us when you're opening and where you are. Second thing is I'm interested in who you're reading right now. And the third thing is I was really struck by, like, Tamisha, you and I've talked before about, seminaries and all you read is white theologians. And how you also said we need to read. And as Pastor Otis Moss told us last Sunday when we were in Chicago, scrolling ain't reading. We need to read. What I was wondering if you would be interested in is if we gave you a bulletin board here at All Saints Church, would you put some information about your bookstore, but every month give us a different book that's sort of your recommendation for us? Does that sound like a good idea? Okay, so we can, help drive some traffic to your store, support this, but also you can help us be a little more well-read. So thank you, and interested in what you're reading now.
So unfortunately, I'm not doing a ton of reading these days because I am T-minus 6 days to the store's opening. We are located at 1361 North Hill Avenue. It is a block above Washington. So I'm on the Hill Avenue side, just across the street from Rite Aid. The grand opening is February 18th at 10 a.m. And we're going to have a local poet, and hopefully Linnell will be available to say a few words. We're going to have some music. We're just going to have a really good time, some coffee and food and desserts, and an opportunity, of course, to shop. So that's February 18th at between 10 and 12. But the store is open until 7 p.m. We'll also have some really neat giveaways. Yeah, the books that I'm reading now are all business-related books. I found a big, giant binder thing a few years ago called Owning Your Own Bookstore, and it's dog-eared and tabbed, and I keep going back to it, so that's what I'm reading right now. Was there a third point I missed? No, it's just the bulletin board. Oh, the bulletin board, I'd be honored to do that. So I will talk to you later. Thanks.
And I think we have to turn around and say goodbye to all the people streaming. We can stay in the room, but we have to say goodbye to y'all. Goodbye. And thank you for streaming. I know there are a lot of people that texted me and reached out and said, I won't be there in person, but I'll be streaming. So that's wonderful that you're all here. Any other question? Yes, and we have Steve right here. Let me